Do we really need another book on Romans of all of the books in the New Testament? Well, apparently we did. Let me tell you what I thought about N.T. Wright's newest. Welcome to Books and Big Ideas, what I'm reading, what I'm thinking about, with Joel Wentz. Alright, I just finished a review copy of Into the Heart of Romans from the extraordinarily prolific and well-known scholar, pastor, N.T. Wright. Thank you to Zondervan for sending me a review for copy. This is my honest take on the book. Let me take you through my typical format of the main idea, the research, the readability, and then my reaction to the book. So the main idea of Into the Heart of Romans is this is a kind of a line-by-line exegesis and commentary on one chapter of Romans, kind of. I mean, that is what it's about. It's really zeroed in on Romans chapter 8, so kind of arguably the centerpiece of that very famous letter from the Apostle Paul. And it is a very kind of close reading of that chapter, and it's kind of line by line. Like each section, each chapter zeroes in on mostly about a section of about 3 to 4 verses of Romans 8, and then really steps you through it. However, it is more than just a kind of word study exegetical piece of research. It's more of a biblical theology with a close reading of Romans 8 as the lens through which to look at kind of the bigger message of Romans and the bigger message of the Bible, actually. So in that way, it's a very interesting, very interesting and atypical kind of exegetical commentary book. It is about that chapter of Romans, but it's really about the message of Romans as a whole as seen through the prism of that chapter. And I would argue kind of a Protestant understanding, a Protestant theology as seen through this one chapter of Romans, with some specific nuances and some specific interpretive kind of moves that he's making that maybe set this understanding apart from some other very common, especially common Protestant Reformed understandings of Romans chapter 8 and Romans as a whole. So that's what Into the Heart of Romans is all about. It's a deep dive into the center of the book, but really with its sights set on a much bigger kind of interpretive move. In a much bigger scope than just looking at what do these little kind of phrases and words in Romans chapter 8 mean. That's the main idea of the book. The research behind it, there's not too much to say here because this is a very much kind of a piece of exegetical and commentary work that's rooted in N.T. Wright's own work. So there are frequent sentences or paragraphs where there will be a footnote where he says, I developed this point that I'm just making here. I developed this in much more length in this book. And he points back to some of his much longer, especially his Christian Origins series. He points back to that series quite a bit, especially Paul and the Faithfulness of God, to nobody's surprise who's familiar with his work. So the research is kind of rooted in his own work that he's already done and already presented in much greater length in other places. This is more of a distillation and a kind of revisiting of some ideas with a few new glosses. So it's also, I mean, he's just such a prolific scholar and somebody who's written so much that this book is just a presentation, a representing in some ways of a lot of his work. So the research is pre-existing research essentially, nothing particularly new on that front. The readability, I want to say a few things about the readability here. N.T. Wright, and I've been a fan of his. I've really appreciated his work and his books for quite some time. They've had a pretty formative role in my life for about 14, 15 years now. And he's an interesting writer and scholar and figure because he writes both extremely popular level style and very more rigorous academic, long, in-depth style. I mean, he's written something like 80, 90 books. It's wild. And they go both on both sides of that spectrum. This, in terms of style and readability, this is very firmly in the more popular, accessible side. It's also very short. It's not long. It's a little over 200 pages, which is very short for N.T. Wright compared to some of his other stuff. And the style is easy to read. It is accessible, more on the conversational end of that spectrum. However, there is a wrinkle, and I found this to be true with his other stuff. Because his grasp of the literature is so comprehensive, and because he's done so much work over so many decades, he has this wealth and this store of information in his mind. And I get this feeling, and if you've read others' books, maybe you can also resonate with this. I get this feelings with his more popular stuff that sometimes he's going almost too quickly over such big ideas that The style is approachable, but the ideas are so big and the scope is so significant that there's a density to what he's moving through. The pace at which he's moving through big ideas and quoting aspects of biblical literature so quickly. I guess what I'm trying to say is it's easy to read sentence by sentence, but to comprehend what he's doing, it takes a little bit of work, and it almost demands the reader to slow down a little bit. Read a little bit slower than the style would suggest, if that makes sense. You can breeze through it, but you're not going to get everything because he's moving so quickly through so many big ideas and concepts that he just has in his head because he's done so much work for so many decades. And so, in a way, as a reader, I almost prefer the academic stuff because he works more deliberately and slowly through these big ideas. However, that's not the case for everybody, and this is much more on the accessible end and an accessible presentation of those bigger books that he goes down every rabbit trail and does every footnote and all of that. So I just wanted to spend a minute on the readability piece because there's a little bit of an interesting. He's unlike a lot of other writers in this vein of work, in that he can write academic and popular, but the popular is still very dense because of the size of the ideas and the arguments he's making. And this is definitely true of Into the Heart of Romans. He makes there are so many paragraphs where I had to be like, okay, I got to reread this just to make sure I'm connecting all these dots that he is just so quickly going through. It's a pretty remarkable. He has a pretty remarkable mind in that way. So that's the readability of this book. And then finally, my reaction to this. Well, I alluded to this into my little stinger at the front, but I grew up evangelical. I grew up evangelical Protestant, conservative Protestant. So Romans is like meat and potatoes stuff for that subculture. I mean, heard so many sermons and sermon series and read so many Bible studies and books on Romans. And Romans is kind of the lens through which so many, Protestant evangelicals kind of get a lot of their theology, or Paul theology especially. It's like Romans is almost arguably like maybe bears too much weight for a lot of conservative Protestants. So I just have been exposed to Romans a ton. And so my stinger at the beginning was like, do we really need another book on this? Is kind of apt. It's kind of pulling on that experience that I've had. And so maybe you can relate to that feeling. I got to say, I've read a handful of stuff on Romans. I particularly really appreciated several years ago McKnight's Reading Romans Backwards. That was one book that, despite my almost over familiarity with Romans, that was one book that brought something fresh to the Romans conversation. So I was thinking about that as I was reading this one from N.T. Wright. I was kind of asking, is this one going to accomplish something like that? And while I would say it's not quite as fresh, as stretching or shifting as McKnight's book was for me, there still is some really fresh stuff in here. And so a couple things I want to say before I wrap this review up. First of all, and other reviewers have noticed this, it's remarkable that someone at N.T. Wright's age and his level of accomplishment, he's willing to revisit his readings of certain texts, and he demonstrates that willingness here. It's part of the reason he seems to have written this book, is to say, I want to bring a new kind of wrinkle into this reading that from his perspective, he's discovering new things about Romans, which is amazing. It's amazing he's doing that. It's amazing that he's modeling that as someone who's so accomplished as he is. He could have just as easily kind of coasted off of everything he's already done, and yet he's still offering, here's some new things I'm learning. So I love that. Secondly, I really, really love the centrality of lament and suffering in the role of the Christian life and in the presentation of the gospel in Romans specifically. That seems to be a really, really big thing he's driving home in this book, is to say that famous verse, for example, all things work together for good. He's adding a spin on that as to say something more like, yes, that's true, but we should not individualize that and kind of prosperityize, if that's a word, that application to say that, this is like individual good for me, even if I don't understand it yet. It's more to say, whatever you're going through, God is using it to contribute to the good of the world. And that includes your suffering, and that includes your pain, and that includes the things that you would rather not be going through. And that's why the Spirit groans with us, is because sometimes there aren't words in that other famous verse. Sometimes there aren't words for what we're experiencing because of the depth of pain and suffering we're experiencing. There's just a groaning, and God's Spirit joins us in that, and God will use that for the good of the world. That's more of the Spirit and the spin and the interpretation he's taking to this. And he roots it in really, really deft exegesis and like a very wide biblical kind of theological look. He moves seamlessly back to prophetic literature and Psalms and the gospel. I mean, he moves in and out of so many different swaths of the Bible and the whole scope of the kind of biblical library. He proposes a really compelling, sensible, carefully argued, richly exegeted in one chapter of Romans that applies broadly to Romans as a whole. He provides a really compelling take. And it is, It is, well, I just use the word compelling. It's very compelling. It's very pastoral. It's very sensitive. And it's very confidently argued. And I think, as a result, while maybe it's not as totally fresh as someone like McKnight's book, it's definitely on that side of kind of fresh writing about Romans that deserves to be on the shelf alongside other books about Romans, and probably deserves to be maybe more so on that shelf than a lot of other writing on Romans is that just kind of retreads old Protestant Reformed arguments. This one really, really belongs there and deserves a good reading, even if you think that you are overly familiar with the book, like maybe I kind of did as I went into it. So there's my thoughts on Into the Heart of Romans from N.T. Wright. Fantastic little book from a scholar who's done incredible work and who's modeling on an ongoing life of learning that the rest of us could probably do good to take a page out of his book, so to speak, and follow in his footsteps. So thanks to Zondervan for sending me the copy and for publishing yet another book from N.T. Wright on the topic that maybe a lot of us thought we didn't need another book on. So as always, thanks for taking some time to watch.